Jehovah's Witnesses in the Divine Purpose book states that the clergy were indicted in the 1924 message. We're going to show from the newspapers what the newspapers of the time period reported and what they understood by the messages that were given at the convention. Did they understand they were indicted? We'll take a look.
And they went with the higher attendance figure.
Yeah.
Additionally.
So now we have 35,000 here, right?
Between 10 and 20, they were at 20.
Up to 35,000 for the public meeting. So,
now, out of curiosity, does it say how many were baptized in this?
Not in this particular one, but we'll get into that in a little bit. We're going to touch back on that subject later on.
You're really hitting me for a loop on this one.
And this is another postcard of that stadium from inside the stadium, another time period piece. So that's what it would have looked like if you were in the stadium there. During a game, it looks like, because you can see the goalposts are up. And this is I actually lived in Columbus, Ohio for a few years. This was the proclamation. This was the indictment. This was published in full in the book Light, which we'll look at in just a little bit here. But this is the indictment. This is their trumpet message. What was that trumpet message? So let's look and see what Light said.
And it's very interesting. If you know the top heading on the second page, he borrowed from a periodical of the time. The title, The World Crisis.
I don't think he even knew that existed. Now, Russell would have,
You don't think he knew?
No. Because when he talks about the history...
reaching out to splinter groups and other Bible students, so, okay.
When you look at his reporting of the history, he's getting his secondhand. And remember, he's coming in the 1907-ish. He wrote his book on 1905 and 1907 about in that area. There wasn't much time. There was such a short duration between the time he came in and the time he took control, and created most of the doctrines Watchtower believes. He was a newbie, and he created all these ideas. But I don't really think he knew the history of where this came from. So there's not really dealt much with, and even the Watchtower themselves, even today, when they talk about the history, make several mistakes when they talk about that pre-early history. And we have a plan to look at that in depth, Watchtower history style, of course.
So I'm not saying this sarcastically against any Jehovah's Witnesses, but basically you believe Rutherford had as much knowledge of Russell's history as Jehovah's Witnesses today have of Rutherford's history.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's very interesting. Okay. Yeah, and how do you know Rutherford's history? Unless you go back and look at the original documentation, you don't know really what happened, because when they tell the history, they don't like to focus on the negative things. They want to focus just on the positive things, and it makes for a nice bedtime story. But when you look at history, you need to look at both the positive and the negative. Be honest with the history. These are the things that happen. We admit the mistakes. We admit bad things happen. But look at the changes that were made and how things progressed. Did things get better? Did they admit their mistake and go back? Or, that's when you got to fact check the history. And unless you have the original documentation, it's very, very difficult. Or the desire to do it. So a lot of claims are made in Watchtower literature. Who's fact-checking it? Mm-hmm. We are.
Watchtower history style.
This is the book. This is Light. This is his reinterpretation of the Revelation message. And, we've talked about this before. It's a wonderful thing that this new light called Light came out so that they could understand Revelation. Because the new light that they got from the finished mystery is now old light. And now even this is different. Mm-hmm. We'll look at the Revelation books the Society's published at some point in the future. But here it's talking about that third angel. As stated earlier, this convention was advertised before the convention happened it to be not controversial. It was very controversial. Many of the messages that came out of this convention were exactly that. They were quite controversial. So this indictment that Rutherford's pointing at in his light was one of those controversial statements. I think they put that it wouldn't be controversial because of the rhetoric that Rutherford was already putting out in the public press. So if they publish it as, well, this isn't going to be controversial, maybe they could get more people. But
now, while they say they don't talk too much about the third trumpet, they do, without mentioning third trumpet, talk about how they delivered a message to the clergy back in the day. But they don't call it the third trumpet.
Right.
For whatever reason. You'd think they would, because they want to tie it in to what...
Well, we're going to get into some of that as well, and some of the claims that have been made about that convention throughout the pages of the Watchtower and its various periodicals. So stay tuned. We'll get into that in just a moment. So here in light, it says, the ecclesiastics indicted for self-examination and refusal to preach Messiah's kingdom. True Christians must preach God's vengeance and comfort mourning humanity. And that's from the Revelation, its grand climax at hand. So they adopted this indictment against basically the clergy, and they distributed a lot of copies of this. But the newspapers didn't quite report this. It was just, they printed so many copies of these and they were giving them out door to door and in the public as well. So here in light, Rutherford's prophetic scheme is starting to take shape. He's starting to reinterpret this entire Watchtower message and create something new.
While still comforting mourning humanity, because millions now living will never die. So
which we'll get into in a little bit.
He still hasn't,
because it starts to change here.
Yeah, he still hasn't gotten the next step.
Yeah, and we're going to get into that in just a little bit. This message changes even more at this convention. So we already had the discussion on the second trumpet. That was our discussion on Judge Rutherford judges sheep and goats, where they started to say, basically, hey, I went to prison, it's all about me, and so therefore we're judging sheep and goats now. That convention and this one is when Watchtower's message starts to get quite judgmental against everyone who disagrees with him. Rutherford was judgmental before, but now he's getting judgmental against everybody. And so we're going to see a little bit of that in this message and some of the things that are claimed about it. So many of the things that Rutherford said in this are no longer taught by Jehovah's Witnesses. He talks about the ransom.
That was the trumpet blast, though. If it was the trumpet blast,
it should be what you teach, right?
Yeah. So then, is there a substitute blast, or there was no trumpet blast then? Because that's, inevitably, that's what they're saying. If what that blast was in 1924 is not true, then that blast, therefore, did not take place. So what is now the third trumpet blast?
Well, it's interesting to look at all the periodicals and what they said about this convention and that trumpet blast. And look how each time they mentioned it, especially the first articles, there were dozens of evidences why that was a trumpet blast. The next time they repeated it, there's less documentation for it, less evidence for that trumpet blast. And the next time they repeat it is down to a paragraph, and the next time is basically a sentence. To the point we get to today where even the Watchtower historians say, we really don't talk about the third trumpet blast that much. We really don't know really what it was all about.
Which goes back to what I'm saying. Therefore, It never happened.
Well, we'll get into that. This is very, very interesting. So this first point that he makes is about the ransom. But the ransom that Rutherford taught, or what Rutherford was teaching at that time, was different than what he was teaching a decade later. And you remember the whole disagreement that Barber and Russell had was on that subject. Over the ransom. And they make this point over and over again in their historical literature that Russell stood strong for this ransom concept and had to separate from Barber.
a dispute arose that would test the loyalty of each member of the Bible study group. Barber had written an article for the Herald spurning the teaching that Christ's death could provide a ransom for sinners. Though professing to believe in the ransom, Barber wrote that the notion that Christ's death paid for mankind's sins was unscriptural and obnoxious to all our ideas of justice. Russell, his young co-editor, disagreed. Through the pages of the Herald, Russell went to great lengths to defend this Bible truth.
Unpleasant though it be, I feel it necessary to take exception to an article by my brother on this subject. I make the objection not from a spirit of controversy, but because I believe the doctrine assailed in that article to be one of the most important teachings of God's Word. Jesus Christ, by the grace of God, tasted death for every man.
In the Herald, Barber fired back,
I tell you, such a theology is false, and such justice an abhorrence to the principle of right and wrong.
Dismayed by Barber's refusal to accept this scriptural teaching, Russell asked him privately either to resign or to sell his share of the paper.
While I still feel that you are a brother in Christ, the points of variance seem to me to be so fundamental and important that full fellowship no longer obtains between you and me. I feel that our relationship should cease.
After months of controversy, Russell's group withdrew from Barber's. Eventually, Russell severed all ties with Herald of the Morning.
Brother Russell realized that he could not restore this man's wavering faith, in fact, lack of faith, and so he took it as the Lord's will that he begin to publish another magazine, Zion's Watchtower and Herald of Christ's Presence.
And yet Rutherford just quietly changed it, and and nobody stood for what Russell was teaching. So it's very interesting what happened to that. So they claim that they're teaching the same ransom. It's not quite the same. It's different. And of course, this message also that millions now living will never die. So in this time period, when he was giving this talk from 1918, 1919, he gave that talk many, many times. Millions now living would never die. They didn't have millions in that Bible student movement at the time. So they were talking about all these non-Bible student, non-Jehovah unbelievers that they saw hope would be in that future paradise, that future kingdom that they taught. So
that they were giving comfort to with the third trumpet blast.
But now it's no longer the case, and this is where some of that starts to change as well in one of these talks that Rutherford gives, and where it went. Basically, it's now the current last Watchtower from recently 2019 states specifically you have to be a baptized, dedicated Jehovah's Witness in order to survive Armageddon. They have no hope for anyone but themselves any longer. That whole judgmental mentality all stem from Rutherford. I guess you could call it Rutherfordism.
And it goes against when the disciples were with Jesus and they saw someone else preaching and, hey, would you like us to stop him? What did Jesus say? No. He's going about preaching. So he acknowledged, even Jesus acknowledged that there were others of the faith that just weren't with him. So it's everything is misconstrued out of all this.
Well, speaking of misconstruing, it doesn't appear that Rutherford understood what others were teaching, or he took a minority and accused the majority of it, because he claims that the Christians in this indictment have denied the fall of man. Well, the whole evangelical fundamentalist movement, that's one of their main points, was the fall of man. They focus so much on the fall of man, the depravity of man. Most of the Christians I know today see that as a very fundamental doctrine. So why he's making this accusation? Who knows? It's interesting. some of these accusations Rutherford making, that he makes about these different clergy, are things that he himself ended up doing.